So we're making this video today because we received some sort of a video response from someone that we really have not, as a party, had much interaction with, at least over the last 4 months. And here in the Green Party of Colorado, we get this sort of commentary quite a bit from folks who, for whatever reason, are angry at the Democratic Party. They're probably angry because Bernie Sanders didn't get any traction. And so they look to the Green Party to be a place where they normally can just land. However, that's probably true for some of the state parties, but in the Green Party of Colorado, we're an intersectional party. We are explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-oppression, and we're the largest socialist party, eco-socialist party in the state of Colorado. So I'm going to go ahead and let this video roll a little bit. I'm going to intersperse with some concepts that really need clarification, and I'm even going to superimpose like some screenshots of emails and communications that we've had with this person to sort of push back on the way that they're framing it. So let's roll it.
This rudeness is silly. I have no problem acknowledging that those of black and brown pigmentation have suffered at the hands of those of white pigmentation horribly, horrendously, as have women. I think I belong to that category. I've also suffered personally because I've been a liberal more than my adult life in a very conservative area. More than one conservative area, actually.
So I want to touch on this concept of liberalism because folks in conservative areas tend to really hang their hats on this definition because it means something to them about a departure from what is considered conservative or right-wing or reactionary. So I'm going to go to the dictionary and read this definition because it seems to fit with what a lot of folks who call themselves liberal actually mean when they describe themselves. And that is a political philosophy based on belief in progress, the essential goodness of the human race, and the autonomy of the individual, and standing for the protection of political and civil liberties. Specifically, such a philosophy that considers government as a crucial instrument for the amelioration of social inequities, such as those involving race, gender, or class. So, when people who call themselves liberals address current events where they talk about politics, there's always a disconnect between what they say they believe in and what the government that they support actually believes in. And this is really demonstrated recently in the rise of neoliberalism. In other words, neoliberalism is this political sort of tactic that turns everything that is public into profit generation for what is private. Common examples include public schools, our roads, tolls, those kinds of things of that nature, right? The other thing about this definition is that it seems to put the responsibility for social change in the hands of people who are in power. Elected officials, that sort of thing like that. And so as a result, what I've noticed with people who are liberal is that there's sort of like an abdication of their personal responsibilities as regards what they themselves should be doing. So a lot of times these aren't the people that show up to protests. These aren't the people who are, offering public comment in the city council or things of that nature. And they tend to really get into the worship of personality around elected officials because they've grafted on their personal philosophy of liberalism onto these elected officials, a lot of times who are Democrats, but not always. So as a result, their attitude is, well, because I am liberal and I like this elected official, that elected official must also be liberal.
However, I don't like being dictated to by anyone. Certainly not by an individual, not by a party, not by a state chapter of a party. To try to pretend that reverse racism and misandry don't exist and to dictate to the party members of the Green Party in the state of Colorado that that is a requirement for membership is not something I wish to associate myself with. Misandry, for those of you who are uninformed as I was until Andrea brought it to my attention, is the fact that men are picked on for being men, just as women are picked on for being men, or for being women. I'm a little upset right now. I personally have watched a number of men lose their children through no bad parenting, no bad financial status, nothing legitimate, and also have to pay so much money that they are unable to legitimately support themselves. They're not trying to deny money to their children. They want to support them, but they have to be able to support themselves as well. And I see that happening. I have witnessed it. And to have the Colorado Green Party attempt to dictate to me that I'm not allowed to use the term misandry or to accept that it is a concept that exists is unacceptable. Now, as far as reverse racism, my husband personally just went through it. Now, my husband, who actually is a quarter Mexican, but looks like the whitest of white guys, just worked for a company owned by Polynesians. If you were to go and research the number of Polynesians that are in that company and the hours they get and the amount of work that they do for those hours and the number of any other culture, black, white, brown, or purple, you would be very much witness to an example of racism that also includes racism against whites. That is my response.
So I want to address this concept of racism versus reverse racism. And I think part of the problem is that there's a dictionary definition that sort of alludes to what I want to get at, but this is kind of part of the problem, right? Racism, according to the dictionary, is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, here in the United States, racism is actually manifested as white supremacy. And according to the English Oxford Dictionary, white supremacy is defined as the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, especially the black race, and should therefore dominate society. So, people who follow critical race theory and who have done studies and are very learned in critical race theory kind of boil it down to a simple equation, and that is that racism equals bigotry plus power. So this Oxford Dictionary definition of white supremacy talks about domination in society. And so in order for white supremacists and people who are white to benefit in the society, their personhood, their feelings, their beliefs, their criteria for success has to be what dominates society. And the way that, of course, that we do that here in the West is via law and policy. And what do I mean by that? So there are policies such as redlining that now get manifested in forms of gentrification. There's the way that standardized tests that are inherently bigoted and biased are used to justify the closure of schools where the students are predominantly low income and students of color, right? And you can come up with a bunch of your other reasons as well, of your examples. And so in order for the white race in the United States to dominate everyone else, more specifically the black race, there has to be power involved. That is the only way that you're going to be able to dominate society. You dominate through economic power, social power, political power, right? And so racism or white supremacy is about systems, not sentiments. Now, it's absolutely true that there are some people of color, some people who come from colonized people that have real negative attitudes towards white people. And, you know, everyone has their story about, the person of color who, uses an epithet toward you and doesn't trust you because you're white and things of this nature. We've all experienced that. But that's about personal sentiment, right? And there isn't necessarily political power, economic or social power that's attached to it. And let me just kind of illustrate one point that this is true. Anybody who is a person of color and has ever had a job and possibly has ever been a supervisor, you have someone who is white on the job and they're very offensive and they tend to mess with everybody else and their work quality is really low. And if you're a person of color, if you're a supervisor, more often than not, if you write that person up and if you fire that person, that decision will get overturned by your boss, who will oftentimes tend to be white. That's kind of the way it is. This is what happens with police all the time as well. We see so many cases, and I don't even really know of any case at the top of my head that this is not true. But what we normally see is that it's the white police officer or the colonized person that's upholding white supremacy through their actions that will shoot a person of color, will shoot a poor person or a homeless person, but specifically a person of color, and they don't get indicted. They don't get charged with anything. Or if they do go to court, they're acquitted because the system of white supremacy needs to dominate those who it believes are poor and exploitable. White supremacy is the offshoot of capitalism, and I would say even capitalism uses white supremacy to survive. Because what white supremacy also does is indicate to us who is more worthy of being exploited. And who's the one that's going to be more exploitable? It's the one with the least amount of power. And in this country, that person, if we're very honest with ourselves, that person who is poor and powerless tends to be black. Now, it's true that from the beginning of the history of the European history of this country, there are two peoples in particular that really have not ever had the institutional power. And that, first of all, the indigenous people, Native Americans, but then certainly the slavery of the people who are of African descent, right? And so we've seen in some cases in the history of the United States where, especially in the case of the Irish, for example, who themselves were colonized by the very same English elite people, right? Um, that happens to be a potato famine at the time. England is involved in this huge proto neoliberal project of stripping all of the resources out of Ireland and sending them over to England for the benefit of the English elite to sell in commodities or even just consume for their own needs, right? Leaving the Irish people completely bereft of everything. They're starving, they're sick, they're dying, they get on a boat, they land in the shores of Philadelphia or Boston or New York, and the second that they get here, they become conscripted, they're exploited, they're beaten, they're relegated to second or third class status, right? And then if you look at the political cartoons of the mid 1800s, for example, the caricatures and the way that Irish people were drawn in the newspapers looked an awful lot like the way that they would draw black people, right? So capitalism uses white supremacy to define who can be exploited and who cannot. And so when we hear people use the term reverse racism, we really have to push back on that term. Again, racism is about systems, not sentiments. And so while you might have someone at your work site, if you're a white person, who's very offensive to you, makes fun of your identity, tells you you can't dance, and all, a myriad of other kinds of things, that's bigotry. That's not racism. Because when push comes to shove, you're the one that's more likely going to keep your job because you're fitting in with the management. And that black person or that other person of color is the one that's more likely going to get fired. And if we're really, really honest about it, that's normally what happens. I realize that there's some cases in which, white people are being fired for using bigoted statements and that sort of thing like that. But more often than not, the network is going to protect that person and they're going to save their job. Again, the way I'm illustrating it with police, right? Racism is systems, not sentiments. And so reverse racism doesn't exist because most people that are impacted by white supremacy and that are the victims of white supremacy and racism are not the ones with the power. And there's no way for them to turn the table and have an equitable outcome. So as you can see from all of the screenshots and things that we've interspersed throughout this video, there wasn't any rudeness involved. There wasn't any dictatorial anything. There wasn't anything like that. We were extremely open-minded and cordial and helpful. And really what this boils down to, and the reason why we made this video, is that folks who don't want to organize in an intersectional lens, who are still mired in false ideas like misandry and reverse racism, they're really just not going to be great candidates to lead locals in the Green Party of Colorado. We've made a determination democratically in our state party that where we're going to orient our efforts is going to be towards the working class, and in particular, those of color. And so, if people of color have to basically fight for respect, and you're using these kinds of concepts, and you've mired yourself in these kinds of concepts, um, what we've seen everywhere is that people of color are not going to invest their time, or other oppressed people are not going to invest their time in trying to build up the Green Party. What we've seen as well is that because of these bylaws and because of the way that we organize, we don't have any trouble growing the party at all. So, I wish this individual well. I hope she finds a political home. But, as I said, I thought this video would be helpful for folks to understand the kind of dialogue that we get, and really the reason why we choose the strategy that we do. So thanks very much. Check us out on the web at coloradogreenparty.org, or you can find us on Facebook. Thanks for your time. Bye.